In writing, voice is the form of the verb to show whether or not the subject is performing the action. Although the terms may not be familiar to you, active and passive voice are easily recognized within sentences. However, the notifications about passive voice within the grammar check of a word processing program can be confusing. In order to understand the concept of active and passive voice, you must first understand the ideas of subject, verb, direct and indirect objects within a sentence. The subject of a sentence is the doer of the action. The verb is the statement of action or being, and the direct object is the receiver of the action. If you were to say, Lewis hit the ball, Lewis is the subject, the one performing the action. Hit is the verb, the action itself, and ball is the direct object, the entity receiving the action. The verb in this sentence is considered transitive because action is moving from the subject across the verb to the direct object. The word transitive, from the Latin trans, meaning across, pertains to verbs that take direct objects. These verbs are said to be in the active voice. A verb is in the active voice when it expresses an action performed by its subject. In other words, the subject is performing the action and the direct object is receiving the action. Passive voice occurs when the subject of the verb is acted upon. In other words, the subject of the sentence received the action. Let's look at the sample sentence first in the active voice and then in the passive voice. Lewis hit the ball. Active voice. The ball was hit by Lewis. Passive voice. In the active voice sentence, the subject, Lewis, performed the action. The direct object, ball, received the action. This illustrates a transitive verb. In the passive voice sentence, the subject, ball, was acted upon. There is no direct object in the sentence. Lewis is the object of the preposition by. Let's try a few examples. You decide if the verb in the sentence is active or passive. Mother drove her car to the supermarket. The blankets were donated for the flood victims. We saw the falcons in the nest. The verbs in the first and third sentences are active voice. In each sentence, the subject, mother or we, respectively, is performing the action. In the second sentence, the subject, blankets, was acted upon. All transitive verbs can be used in the passive voice. The direct object becomes the subject, and a form of the verb to be is added to the sentence. Let's take a look at the two previous active verb sentences and make them passive voice. Mother drove her car to the supermarket. Her car was driven by mother to the supermarket. We saw the falcons in the nest. The falcons in the nest were seen by us. Stylistically, the active voice is preferred in writing. You may have received notification when performing a grammar check that you have sentences in the passive voice, but you weren't sure how to remedy the issue. Basically, consider who or what is performing the action and then place that entity as the subject of the sentence. Take a look at each of the following sentences in the passive voice, then change the sentence to put it in the active voice. A piece of pie should be eaten by you. You should eat a piece of pie. The ornamental trees were pruned by the arborist. The arborist pruned the ornamental trees. By whom were you taught to snowboard? Who taught you to snowboard? I hope you were able to reconstruct those sentences. The third one was certainly a little tricky. Passive voice at times just sounds awkward, and you could see that the active voice allows your writing to be tighter, more economical, and more direct. Active sentences that have direct objects may also accommodate indirect objects. An indirect object indicates to whom or for whom the action is being committed. You can have an indirect object only when there is a direct object. Here are a few examples of active sentences with indirect objects. Esther prepared me a 3-course meal. Mr. Tompkins faxed his office the contract. The company promised some consumers a refund. In the first sentence, Esther, the subject, prepared a meal, the direct object. The word me functions as the indirect object because it's telling to whom or for whom the meal is being prepared. In the second sentence, contract is the direct object and office is the indirect object. In the third sentence, refund is the direct object and consumers is the indirect object. In a sentence that has both direct and indirect objects, either one can be used as the subject in a passive construction. The other object is retained as a complement to the verb. Let's take one sentence with active construction and create 2 sentences in the passive voice to illustrate the retained object. Michael sent his mother a Mother's Day card. His mother was sent a Mother's Day card. A Mother's Day card was sent his mother. The first sentence contains an indirect object, mother, and a direct object, Mother's Day card. The second sentence uses the indirect object as the subject, and the direct object becomes a complement to the verb, the retained object. The third sentence uses the direct object as the subject, and the indirect object becomes the complement to the verb, the retained object. Sentences in the passive voice are typically less forceful, and use of the passive voice is often discouraged. Yet there are circumstances in which the passive voice is preferable. Be aware, however, that you should use the passive voice sparingly. If the person or entity is unknown, you may choose to use the passive voice as in the following example. The corner delicatessen was burglarized last night. Clearly, someone committed a crime, but the doer of the action is not known. You may also choose not to reveal the doer of the action, placing more emphasis on the action itself and the entity upon whom it is being performed, as in the following example. The patient was treated and released. Obviously, medical personnel had treated and released the patient, but the writer wanted to emphasize the condition of the patient. Overall, the active voice is generally stronger and a more desirable construction. Try your hand at some sample sentences. For each one, identify it as active or passive voice. If it is passive, decide whether it should be changed to active. If so, change it to active voice. A turkey sandwich and a Caesar salad were eaten by Gerald. This sentence is passive, and I would change it to read, Gerald ate a turkey sandwich and a Caesar salad. 3 black bears were seen near the entrance to the highway. This sentence is passive, but I would not change it. We don't know who saw the bears, and the emphasis is on the bears. The relentless rain flooded our neighborhood for the 2nd time this year. This sentence is active. The lab reports will be completed by the students by the end of the class period. This sentence is passive, and I would change it to read, the students will complete the lab reports by the end of the class period. His motorcycle was ridden by him across the country. This sentence is passive, and I would change it to read, he rode his motorcycle across the country. The game was halted after the first clap of thunder. This sentence is passive, but I would not change it. So in review, active voice is preferred in your writing because it is stylistically stronger and more efficient. Passive voice may be used sparingly when the doer is not known or when it is desirable not to reveal the doer.